So in a recent talk for the for the London Methodist District, Reverend Dr. Elaine Heath, who is a much wiser woman than I think I will ever be, talked about, talked about neighbouring in a world full of trauma, neighbouring in a world of climate injustice, a world of greed, and a world of imbalance of power. And she said, if we don't become informed about how trauma resides in people's bodies and how trauma lives on in neighbourhoods through the residue of being sinned against as people groups, we won't be able to be good news. In fact, we'll re-inflict wounds without even realising what we're doing. Let me just stop sharing that. Essentially, Elaine's overall message was that many of our neighbours and many of us are living with trauma in our bodies. Our work as the church is to play our part in bringing justice and bringing healing. The children and young people and families that we work with are longing for peace, safety, love, and an identity that's based on being God's beloved. They need people who love well to help them find that safety. So, what is trauma? Trauma is essentially what happens when we're faced with long-term or large-scale stressful situations. It causes our brains to adapt to survive, and it leaves us more vulnerable to developing mental health issues later on. Stress in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. When we want to build and strengthen our muscles, we put them under stress, otherwise known as exercise, which I find quite stressful, and that helps to strengthen our muscles. And our brain is a muscle too. So stress helps to strengthen our brains, helps to strengthen our resilience. But when we're exercising, if we do it for too long, if we ask too much of our muscles, if we lift too heavy a weight, then that can hurt our bodies. And it's the same thing with our brains. If we ask too much of them, if we give them too much to cope with in one go, then we can hurt them. And that's essentially what trauma is. I have a method that I use when I'm running workshops with children and young people to try and explain this. And you may have seen this done before, because I know a few other people use this model. And I'm going to share it with you now. I'm going to warn you, this is really, really oversimplified science. So I apologise now to any medical doctors in the room, any nurses, and I certainly wouldn't recommend using any of what I'm about to say to try and pass any GCSE exams, because it's really oversimplified. But essentially, here goes. So our brain is made up of three parts. So we have the reptilian brain, which is where we operate on instinct. We have our limbic brain, which is our warm and fuzzy emotional core. So that's the bit that floods our bodies with really nice hormones. We can hug somebody we love. And then we have the neocortex, which is our rational, problem-solving, planning ahead part of our brain. I'm not going to worry too much about the warm and fuzzy bit, the limbic emotional brain today. We're going to talk more about the reptilian brain and the neocortex. So if you imagine that my hand is a really basic model of my brain, and my wrist is my brainstem, which is sending messages to the rest of my body. The lower part of my hand is my reptilian brain, and part of that is what we call the amygdala, which I'm going to use my thumb to represent. Now, amygdala is a really hard word to remember, so I often call that my bodyguard, because the amygdala's job as part of that reptilian brain is to basically keep me alive. And most of the time, it's getting on with that job quietly, tucked away at the bottom of my brain, just reminding me, because I need reminding sometimes, to breathe, to digest food, to kind of move around sometimes so I don't, kind of atrophy. So that's the amygdala's job, the bodyguard's job. And then sitting over that, my fingers can represent that neocortex. And again, that's a really big word. So I'm going to call my neocortex my wise leader. And it's the wise leader that we normally want to have in control, because our wise leader is the part of our brain, as I've said, that helps us to problem solve, helps us to plan ahead, helps us to see into the future and kind of navigate change. So it's our wise leader that we always want to have in control. But if we're frightened by something, so like a big, hungry, scary bear that jumps out from behind a tree, we get a lot of those in the West Midlands, then our bodyguard tries to take control. It triggers our fight or flight response. So it starts to try and kick our wise leader out of its seat of control, out of its seat of power. And we don't need to think rationally in that situation. All we need is for our heart rate to increase and our muscles to tense so that we can just run away from that bear as fast as we possibly can. And that's where we get the expression flipping our lid, because we are literally, our limbic brain and our reptilian brain are literally trying to separate off from our neocortex. Our bodyguard is trying to separate off from our wise leader and kick the wise leader out of control. Hopefully that's all kind of making sense so far. It made sense to a group of rainbows I talked to recently, so hopefully you're following. And this system works great most of the time, but there are a few problems with it. The first is that our bodyguard really isn't very clever. Our bodyguard just wants to help us. So even when the frightening thing isn't a scary bear, maybe it's an exam or a first date, or giving a speech to a conference, that's really scary. And our bodyguard may sense that. And it wants to help because it knows we're frightened. But actually, when you're doing all those things, what you really need is your wise leader in control. And this is where emotional regulation practices such as deep breathing, mindfulness, and grounding techniques can really help, because they help us to calm down. They reassure our bodyguard that it's okay, that we're safe. And that means that our wise leader can come back into control. The second problem is that we are only really designed to live in a state of fight or flight for short periods of time, because it's really exhausting to have your heart pounding and breathing faster and all these kind of hormones rushing around your body. We only need it for as long as it takes to hightail it away from that big scary bear. This last 18 months, we all will have been living in some form of state of fight or flight, because we've been hearing lots of stuff on the news about how dangerous the world is at the moment, particularly with regards to the pandemic. You may have noticed that you've been more tired, more emotional, more sensitive recently. And when you think about it, it's actually no surprise whatsoever, because we've been constantly in a battle to keep our wise leader in control and put our bodyguard back in its place. The third issue is that the bodyguard has a really long memory. It can rewire our brain so that it has more power than it should. And there's a strong relationship as well between what is happening in our brain and what is happening in our bodies and how we feel physically. And that's what Lynne was talking about when she talked about trauma residing in our bodies. So what is the impact of trauma? Trauma can affect our ability to and our opportunities to make and maintain friendships. It can miss social cues that help us to do that. If our wise leader doesn't have its rightful place in control, then we might struggle at school, we might struggle to achieve academically and learn new skills. We might find it harder to learn and to navigate change. It can affect our working memory, and it can also affect our ability to adapt, and it can also affect our emotional regulation skills, such as our anger management. And understanding this can really help us when we're dealing with challenging behaviour in children and in adults. We should seek connection before correction. I've heard of the trauma-informed approach described as understanding a person's needs onion. So the first layer that we come across when we meet somebody is their behaviours, and that's often what we kind of respond to immediately. The layer underneath that are the feelings that perhaps are triggering those behaviours. And then underneath that are that person's experiences, the things that they've lived through, and their unmet needs. So our needs onion. If we start from a place of understanding that challenging behaviour is often consciously or unconsciously a person's attempt to communicate a need. For example, they don't understand what's being asked of them, they're hungry or tired or bored, they're feeling overwhelmed, they're feeling out of place or embarrassed, then we can really start to embody that trauma-informed approach that Elaine outlined in her talk. I'm going to pause for a moment and ask people to just kind of respond in chat, because Ecclesiastes 3:4 tells us that there is a time to cry and a time to laugh, a time to grieve and a time to dance. And I just wonder if people wanted to share some thoughts on whether they feel that church is or should be the place where we welcome those big feelings that I've just been talking about. I'm going to take a pause and a sip of water so that the awkward silence can sit and people can share their thoughts in chat.
I want to say, Lynn, I think that's really helpful, reminding us about how the brain works. And yeah, for me, I love the idea that the estate I live on is definitely a traumatized estate. So thank you. That's given me lots to think about.
Thank you, Rachel. I encourage you to keep sharing some thoughts in chat. Oh, go on, carry on.
I was going to say, it feels to me as if, though, you know, most of us here have leadership roles of some sort, and we all have various bits of what you've described. Probably, I recognise it in myself from the last year and a half that I feel like, you know, I've got to deal with myself before I can be there for other people to do it, or be prepared. You know, how much is that judgment of how messy to be in front of other people, that you have a sort of responsibility, getting that right and finding a safe place for yourself before you offer it to other people. It's lots of decisions to make there, I think. Yeah. Thank you, Alison. We've had a comment in chat as well from Anne. It's perhaps not always the place to share the big things. I once shared an anxiety and was told that all I had to do was pray and God would help me. The pressure being that if I was still anxious, I wasn't praying hard enough, and I want to discourage this pressure. I completely hear that, Anne. And that's why I do what I do. That's why I am always happy to turn up to church meetings and talk about this stuff, because I just think the church needs to be better and needs to kind of start to understand that, you know, these are perfectly natural emotions. They're perfectly natural reactions, which I'll go on to talk about in a minute. And we just need to be better at understanding them and modelling good practice when it comes to supporting each other. And as Alison's just really helpfully said, looking after ourselves as well. So thank you, Anne. And I'm really sorry that that was your experience. We've got loads of chat coming in now. Yeah, if we can't be the space where these big emotions can be shared, then where can we share those big emotions? We need to be able to sit with people in the rubbish times and not come out with those trite responses. Amen. Thank you. I'm just going to allow those kind of chat comments to keep coming in. But I completely agree. I personally believe that we all need to just become so much better at understanding how our brains work and talking about our feelings. If we talked more about our emotions, why they sometimes get out of control and how we manage them, if we model healthy emotional regulation and practice repair when our emotions get out of control, because they always do, then we can contribute to a more mentally healthy world. And people with emotional regulation skills are able to respond more appropriately to emotional situations, adjust well to change, and show a high tolerance for frustration and stress. Talking about and naming resilience helps to build it. And fight or flight and powerful emotions are natural responses, as is asking questions, even, and this is a bit controversial, desires for revenge. They're natural human responses. And if we can name those the natural and normal nature of those experiences, we can help people prevent creating a no one would understand me narrative in their brains. That idea that you're on your own, we can prevent that if we start to talk about the fact these are normal things. If we can name them as normal, then people can be reassured that they're not alone, that other people have experienced those thoughts and feelings and have chosen not to make the negative response. And that helps people to understand that they also have a choice and have some power. I've been helping to run a youth group that serves a large local estate for over 15 years now, probably way over. I think I've been running a youth group longer than most of the current members have been alive, which is quite a scary thought. And during that time, I've had the privilege of coming alongside children who've had more than their fair share of adverse childhood experiences and trauma. I have wept for the hurt of those young people that I love to serve. I've got angry, I've got apoplectic with rage sometimes at the injustices that I see them living with that keep them on the margins. I've been on the receiving end, as I'm sure many people here have, of challenging behaviour that is rooted in trauma and a lack of emotional regulation. I'm sharing all this because I just want to say that I am aware that this is not easy stuff. It's really kind of difficult sometimes, it's challenging to us. But what a privilege when a young person makes you their trusted adult. What a privilege when, you know, you realise that if you were not in that space, they would not have anybody to share that trauma with. Along with the pain, I've also known the joy of seeing a face light up when you name the good stuff, the gifts, the skills, the beauty, the potential that you see in those young people. It's a real honour to be the bearer of good news, to tell young people that have heard far too many times that they've got nothing to offer the world, that you think that they're worth your time, your energy, you value them and you love them. And more than that, God loves them and they're fearfully and wonderfully made. So this brings me to the last thing that I want to share before we put you into some small groups where you can kind of continue some of these conversations. And I want to offer some encouragement that even in the most difficult and tragic of circumstances, we can bring hope and make a difference, even when it feels like an uphill struggle. The first thing I want to offer is that we as the church can help to alleviate what Dr. Bruce Perry, who is Mr. Trauma himself, calls relational poverty. He basically argues that when facing adversity, we are far less likely to experience bad outcomes if we have connections to family or community or culture. Essentially, he argues that each one of us can play a part in offering life-saving and life-changing experiences for young people just by showing up and listening. He summarises that with the thought that resilience is really basically all about how you're connected. The church at its best can offer that to people. It can be family and community where people don't have that. And it can help to bolster people's resilience to stress through making them feel loved and valued and connected. The next thing I want to offer is, as a cause for hope, is the importance of something called protective and compensatory experiences, which is a really big mouthful. It's PACEs for short. And this is offered as an alternative. We talk a lot about ACEs, and that can kind of start to make us feel a little bit kind of down and like there's nothing we can do, because we see the young people we work with and we understand how many adverse childhood experiences they're living with. But PACEs, positive, protective and compensatory experiences, can help to counteract those better known ACEs, such as things like poverty and abuse and neglect. So PACEs, just as a side note, are not to be confused with the PACE approach to trauma. That's a different thing, also worth looking at, but I don't have time to talk about that today. So in an article written for the Child and Family blog, Jennifer Hayes Grudo and Amanda Sheffield Morris from Oklahoma State University offer a list, and I'm going to share this list now. Based on research, and these are 10 relationships and resources that are proven to counter the impact of adverse experiences that may mean a child's outcomes may turn out to be much better than you'd originally think in the face of difficult circumstances. So the 10 PACEs they offer are receiving unconditional love, which isn't about never getting into trouble, but it's about knowing that somebody's on your side and cherishes you. Having a best friend, so giving children a sense of being important, having someone to talk to, helping them to learn how to deal with conflict and grow a relationship. Volunteering in the community, learning about the needs of others, gives an insight into a world beyond their own and helps them to ask for help as well when they need it. Being part of a group, a sense of belonging outside the family, and a chance to learn about themselves as friends or even leaders in different contexts can really benefit young people. And taking part in things like school clubs and sports is linked to academic success, psychological well-being, and lower rates of substance abuse as well. Having a mentor, an adult other than a parent who can be trusted and counted on for support and advice, and that helps to protect against the worst effects of stress. It helps protect against academic difficulties and reduces the incidence of high-risk activities. Living in a clean, safe home with enough food, I mean, that one's not rocket science, it's kind of a crucial primary need, and good regular nutrition is important for brain development and protects against health problems, obviously. And feeling safe and secure at home helps us to manage that fight or flight response. Getting an education, the opportunity to learn and be educated in an environment with boundaries and rules also protects children from risk. And having a hobby, any recreational activity, any that helps to teach self-discipline, self-regulation, and provides routine and a sense of mastery and achievement.
Engaging in physical activity, it helps to handle the physiological effects of stress on the body, and it improves mood and mental health and reduces the likelihood of unhelpful coping mechanisms such as things like self-harm and substance abuse. And having rules and routines. So when children know what to expect and the limits are clear, it can bring security. I think Rob is very helpfully going to share those 10 things in chat. And we're going to put you into small groups, maybe briefly introduce yourself, but then get on with some conversations about reflections that maybe you've had from some of the stuff I've shared. And if you want some direction for your conversation, perhaps focus on that list of those paces and think about what your church or your project offers already that supports those, and what perhaps you could kind of choose to focus on or do more of. And then we'll obviously encourage people to share thoughts in chat when they come back into the main room as well, and I'll wrap up. Thank you, Rob. But I just one final note before we kind of wrap up this session and Sarah talks to you about what's happening in the workshops. Just you can't pour from an empty cup. That's really important to note. And I think I think Alison, when we shared earlier, was talking about this a little bit. We're instructed to love each other as we love ourselves. What does it look like to love yourself? And it's okay to love yourself. When it comes to self-care, that's not selfish. Self-care helps us to take care of our own minds and emotional well-being. It models good practice to others. And it helps us to avoid ministry burnout and compassion fatigue, you know, where our threshold for being shocked and upset kind of keeps shifting, and it takes a lot more to kind of get us angry about the injustice that we see. So I'd like you to consider just maybe during the comfort break or, you know, when you've got kind of space today, just what is one thing that you're going to do to make sure you're practicing that self-care as well, because it's so important when you're seeking to support the emotional well-being of others that you start with yourself first, just as you would with physical first aid. You make sure you're okay first before you rush in to help others. So I'd just like to end on that note of encouragement. And thank you for engaging. I'm so sorry it felt like such a whirlwind and